I pulled up to the Baker mansion as the last traces of daylight faded from the October sky. The Victorian estate stood alone at the end of a winding driveway in the Berkeley Hills, its windows glowing warmly against the growing darkness. I checked my watch, 7:15 p.m. right on time, and grabbed my backpack stuffed with textbooks before heading to the front door. The massive oak door swung open before I could knock. A tall man with dark hair graying at the temples stood in the entryway dressed in a perfectly tailored suit. "Sarah Wilson?" he asked, extending his hand. "Thomas Baker. Thank you for coming on such short notice." I shook his hand. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Baker. Please call me Thomas." He stepped aside to let me in. "My wife and I don't often attend social functions, but this charity gala is important for my company. We should be back shortly after midnight." The front entrance opened into a grand entrance hall with a sweeping staircase and polished hardwood floors. Family photos lined the walls, mostly featuring a small boy with pale features and large blue eyes. A woman appeared at the top of the stairs, adjusting an earring. She wore a floor-length black gown that shined as she came down. Her blonde hair fell in perfect waves around her shoulders, but I noticed tension in her face that didn't match her elegant appearance. "Emily, this is Sarah," Thomas said. Emily's smile seemed rehearsed. "Thank you for coming, Sarah. Oliver is already asleep. He had a busy day." She turned to a side table and picked up a sheet of paper. "I've written down some instructions for you." I took the paper, expecting the usual emergency contact information and bedtime reminders. Instead, I found a numbered list of oddly specific rules. "These might seem unusual," Emily said, watching my face as I read them, "but they're very important." The list read: 1. Check on Oliver every 30 minutes, but do not wake him if he's sleeping. 2. If you hear voices or footsteps in the hallway between midnight and 2 a.m., go to the nursery next to Oliver's room, lock the door, and use the earplugs in the top drawer of the changing table. 3. If Oliver wakes and asks for water, give him 1 glass only. If he says, "That's not enough," call us immediately and leave the house. 4. If you hear laughter or crying that doesn't sound like Oliver, ignore it. Do not investigate. 5. Keep all doors closed at all times. 6. Stay on the first and second floors only. The third floor and basement are strictly off limits. I looked up from the paper. These are specific. Is there something I should know about the house or Oliver? Emily's fingers twisted together. They're just precautions for everyone's safety. Thomas placed a hand on his wife's shoulder. "Our son sleepwalks sometimes, and this old house makes strange noises that can be unsettling if you're not used to them." I nodded slowly, putting the list into my pocket. The rules seemed like a lot for sleepwalking, but I needed this job. The Bakers were paying well, enough to cover next month's textbooks. "Let me show you around," Emily said, her voice steadier now. She led me through the first floor, a spacious kitchen with modern appliances that looked out of place against the Victorian architecture, a formal dining room with a table that could seat 12, a living room with plush furniture and a massive fireplace, and a small study lined with books. "You can study or watch TV in the living room," Emily said. "There's food in the kitchen if you get hungry. Now let's check on Oliver." We climbed the grand staircase to the second floor. The hallway stretched in both directions, lined with closed doors. Emily led me to the third door on the right and quietly pushed it open. Oliver's room was painted a soft blue, with glow-in-the-dark stars stuck to the ceiling. A nightlight gave off gentle light across walls decorated with space-themed pictures. The boy himself lay in a bed that looked too large for his small body, his chest rising and falling with steady breaths. His light brown hair fell across his forehead, and his face looked peaceful in sleep. Emily stood in the doorway, watching him with a focus that seemed unusual to me. "The nursery is right next door," she whispered, pointing to a door on the left. "If anything happens, that's where you should go." What would happen? I asked quietly. She didn't answer directly. Just follow the rules, Sarah, especially about the water. Before I could ask more questions, Thomas appeared in the hallway. Emily, we need to go if we want to make it to the city on time. Emily nodded, took one last look at Oliver, and pulled the door until it was almost closed, leaving it open just a crack. Call if you need anything at all. We'll have our phones with us the entire time. I followed them back downstairs. Thomas handed me a piece of paper with their contact information and the address of the event in San Francisco. After a few more instructions and reassurances, they finally left, the sound of their car engine fading as they drove down the long driveway. Alone in the big house, I went to the living room and spread my anthropology textbook and notes on the coffee table. I had a paper due Monday, and studying would help distract me from the odd list of rules and the worry I felt. The house was old and made all the sounds old houses make, wood expanding and contracting, pipes ticking, wind sneaking through tiny gaps in window frames. Every creak and groan made me look up from my textbook, but I told myself to stop being ridiculous. I'd grown up in an old house too. These were normal sounds. At 8:30, I checked on Oliver as instructed. He hadn't moved. At 9, I checked again, still sleeping peacefully. I made myself a sandwich in the kitchen at 9:30, noting how normal and harmless the house looked with all the lights on. By 10, I'd made decent progress on my paper and checked on Oliver twice more. Each time he slept soundly, showing no signs of the sleepwalking his father had mentioned. At 10:45, a particularly loud creak from upstairs made me freeze. It sounded like a footstep on the hardwood floor. I waited, listening hard, but heard nothing else. My mind immediately went to the list of rules, specifically number 4 about laughter or crying. But this wasn't laughter or crying, just a creak. Old houses creak. Still, I decided it was time for another check on Oliver. I climbed the stairs, trying to step lightly on the parts of the treads that didn't squeak. The upstairs hallway was dimly lit by small wall sconces that threw more shadows than light. I pushed Oliver's door open slowly, wincing at its slight squeak. The boy lay in the same position, still sleeping soundly, his chest rising and falling in the same steady rhythm. Nothing had changed. I closed the door to its original slightly ajar position and stood in the hallway, listening. The house settled around me, its wooden bones adjusting to the cooling night air. Just an old house being an old house, I told myself as I headed back downstairs. The clock on the living room wall read 11 p.m. when I next looked up from my textbook. 1 hour until midnight, when rule number 2 might come into play. I couldn't imagine what voices or footsteps Emily expected me to hear, unless Oliver had a habit of getting up in the middle of the night. I marked my page and went upstairs for another check. Oliver slept peacefully, exactly as before. Standing in his doorway, I wondered what lay behind all the other closed doors in this big house and what could possibly be on the off-limits 3rd floor. But those questions would have to wait. I had a few more pages of reading to finish before midnight, when things might get interesting, if I believed the baker's strange list of rules. I took one last look at Oliver's sleeping form, his chest rising and falling rhythmically, and quietly pulled his door back to its original position. I tried to focus on my anthropology textbook as the clock ticked closer to midnight. The words blurred together as my mind kept going back to the baker's strange list of rules, especially rule number 2, about voices and footsteps between midnight and 2 a.m. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 12, its deep chimes carrying through the silent house. I looked up from my reading, holding my breath without realizing it, half expecting to hear something. For several seconds, nothing happened, and I let out a slow breath. Just my imagination running wild, I thought, turning back to my textbook. Then I heard it, a whisper so faint I almost missed it, coming from upstairs. I froze, pencil hovering over my notes. Maybe it was just the wind. or the house settling. But then another whisper joined the first, and another, until there was a quiet chorus of unclear murmurings. I closed my book and stood up, listening hard. The voices grew louder, some high and childlike, others deeper and adult. They seemed to be having a conversation, though I couldn't make out the words. I crept to the bottom of the stairs, gripping the banister. The voices were definitely coming from the second-floor hallway, right outside Oliver's room. I thought about checking on him, but Emily's instructions had been very specific. Go to the nursery, lock the door, use the earplugs. I took the stairs slowly, trying to keep my footsteps quiet. The whispers continued, growing clearer as I reached the top. I still couldn't understand what they were saying. It was like listening to a conversation through a wall. But there were at least 5 or 6 distinct voices talking over each other. The hallway was dimly lit by the small wall sconces. I looked toward Oliver's door, still cracked open as we'd left it. The voices were coming from just outside it, but I couldn't see anyone there. Following Emily's instructions, I quickly slipped into the nursery next to Oliver's room. I closed the door behind me and turned the lock with shaking fingers. The nursery was bathed in soft light from a small lamp that looked like a moon. A crib stood empty against one wall, and a changing table was positioned under the window. The room looked prepared for a baby that wasn't there. I went straight to the changing table and pulled open the top drawer. Just as Emily had said, a small box of foam earplugs sat inside. I grabbed 2 and pushed them into my ears, muffling the world around me. Even with the earplugs, I could still hear them, muted now, but unmistakably there. Footsteps joined the voices, slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth outside the nursery door. I backed away, moving to the corner farthest from the door. There was a rocking chair there, and I sank into it, pulling my knees up to my chest. The digital clock on the nightstand read 12:07 a.m. Nearly 2 hours to go. The footsteps continued their pacing, sometimes pausing right outside the nursery door. During one of these pauses, the doorknob rattled slightly, not like someone was trying to turn it, but as if a hand had rested lightly upon it. Testing. I held my breath, watching the knob. It rattled again, and I pushed myself deeper into the rocking chair. The voices outside grew louder for a moment, as if arguing, before falling back to their previous level. The clock's red numbers changed with painful slowness. 12:23, 12:46, 1:18. Each minute stretched endlessly as I sat rigid in the chair, watching the door. Sometimes the voices would fade almost completely, then surge back louder than before. The footsteps would retreat down the hall only to return minutes later. Once, at around 1:30, I heard what sounded like a child's laugh, quickly cut off. By 1:45, my back ached from sitting so tensely, and my mouth was dry from fear. The doorknob had rattled twice more, but never turned. The clock ticked over to 1:58, then 1:59. As the numbers changed to 2:00, the footsteps outside suddenly stopped. The voices fell silent all at once, as if someone had flipped a switch. I waited, not daring to move, as the minutes ticked by. 2:01, 2:02, 2:03. At 2:05, I cautiously removed one earplug. Nothing. I pulled out the second and listened again. The house was completely silent. No whispers, no footsteps. Just the normal creaks and groans of an old building. I waited another 5 minutes before finally standing, my joints stiff from sitting so long in one position. I approached the door and pressed my ear against it. Still nothing. Taking a deep breath, I unlocked the door and opened it a crack. The hallway was empty, the sconces casting the same dim light as before. No sign that anything unusual had happened. I stepped out, glancing in both directions. Nothing moved in the shadows. I walked to Oliver's room and peeked inside. He lay exactly as he had earlier, his small chest rising and falling with deep, even breaths. The digital clock on his bedside table read 2:13 a.m. Whatever had been in the hallway, it hadn't bothered him at all. I closed his door to the same slightly open position and made my way back downstairs on shaky legs. In the well-lit living room, the experience already felt dreamlike. Had I really heard voices and footsteps? Or had I dozed off while reading and dreamed the whole thing? But I knew I hadn't been sleeping. The fear had been too real, the sounds too clear, even through the earplugs. I poured myself a glass of water in the kitchen, trying to calm my nerves. The rules Emily had given me now seemed less like bizarre overprotection and more like necessary safety measures. What exactly was happening in this house? And why would the Bakers continue to live here, especially with a young child? I returned to the living room and tried to focus on my textbook again, but my mind kept replaying the sounds from the hallway. Eventually, I gave up on studying and just sat alert on the couch, listening to the house. The baby monitor on the coffee table crackled to life at 2:30 a.m. Oliver's cries came through clearly, making me jump even though I'd been expecting some reaction after such a strange night. I hurried upstairs, relieved to have a normal, explainable reason to be moving through the quiet house. The hallway remained empty and still as I pushed open Oliver's door. He sat upright in bed, his blue eyes wide open and alert for a child who should have been groggy with sleep. The nightlight cast shadows across his face, making him look older somehow. "I'm thirsty," he said, his voice small but clear. I nodded and tried to smile reassuringly. "I'll get you some water, okay? I'll be right back." I went downstairs to the kitchen, filled a glass with tap water, and quickly made my way back up. Oliver hadn't moved. He sat in exactly the same position, staring at the door as if waiting. "Here you go," I said, handing him the glass. He took it without a word and drank it all in several long gulps. Then he looked up at me, his face blank and his eyes reflecting the dim light in a way that made them look almost colorless. "That's not enough," he said flatly. A chill ran down my arms. Emily's third rule flashed through my mind. If Oliver asks for water and says, "That's not enough," call us immediately and leave the house. I stepped back from his bed, my phone already in my hand. Emily's words repeated in my mind. If he says, "That's not enough," call us immediately and leave the house. My fingers shook as I scrolled to Emily's number and hit call. She answered on the first ring. "Hello? Sarah?" Her voice came through sharp and clear. "He said it," I whispered, backing toward the door while keeping my eyes on Oliver. He drank the water and said it's not enough. There was a split second of silence before Emily spoke again. "Get out now. Don't look back." "But what about... just go?" The urgency in her voice made my skin cold. "Leave everything. We're on our way home." I ended the call and reached for the door frame, ready to run. Oliver sat perfectly still, watching me with those big blue eyes. His face remained without expression, but something about his look wasn't right. Wasn't a 6-year-old boy's look at all. "You should go," he said softly, his head tilting slightly. "They're getting angry." I turned and ran into the hallway. Behind me, Oliver burst into laughter, high-pitched and wild, nothing like the quiet child I'd watched all evening. The sound followed me down the corridor as I raced toward the stairs. The laughter grew louder as I hit the first step, bouncing off the walls around me. It multiplied, sounding like it was coming from every closed door along the upstairs hallway. Not just Oliver's laugh, but other voices too, some young, some older, all cackling in unison. I grabbed the banister and took the stairs 2 at a time, nearly tripping at the bottom. The grand entrance hall felt massive and exposed. The laughter continued overhead, growing louder. The chandelier swayed slightly, though there was no breeze. My backpack and textbooks were still in the living room, but I ignored them, heading straight for the front door. My fingers fumbled with the lock, twisting and pulling until it finally gave way. The massive oak door felt heavier than before, as if something was pushing against it from the other side. Cool night air hit my face as I yanked the door open and stumbled onto the porch. The laughter cut off instantly when the door closed behind me, leaving only the sound of my ragged breathing and distant traffic below the hills. I ran to my car, started the engine, and sped down the winding driveway, checking the rearview mirror every few seconds. The mansion grew smaller behind me, its windows still lit like watchful eyes. By the time I reached my apartment near campus, my breathing had steadied, but I couldn't shake the cold feeling that had settled in my stomach. I double-locked my apartment door and checked all the windows before collapsing onto my bed. My phone buzzed with a text message. Emily's name appeared on the screen. "Are you safe? Don't come back tonight." I typed back a quick response. "I'm home." "What happened with Oliver?" 3 dots appeared, disappeared, then appeared again. Finally, "We'll talk tomorrow. Try to rest." Sleep was impossible. I lay awake for hours, replaying the events in my mind. Oliver's blank expression, that unnatural laughter following me down the stairs, the way it seemed to come from everywhere at once. I must have fallen asleep eventually because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through my blinds and someone was knocking at my door. I grabbed my phone, 9:17 a.m. The knocking continued, calm but persistent. I checked the peephole and saw Thomas Baker standing in the hallway dressed in a casual sweater and slacks, a stark contrast to his formal attire from the night before. I opened the door but didn't invite him in. "Good morning, Sarah," he said, his expression carefully neutral. "I wanted to check on you after last night." "I'm fine," I said, though we both knew it wasn't true. "What happened with Oliver after I left?" Thomas sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Emily and I got home about 20 minutes after your call. Oliver was asleep when we arrived, or seemed to be. He doesn't remember anything this morning. That wasn't normal, Mr. Baker. That wasn't sleepwalking." "No," he agreed quietly. "It wasn't." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope. "Here's payment for last night with a little extra for the unexpected circumstances." I took the envelope, feeling its substantial weight. "Thank you, but I don't need—" "Please," he cut in. "It's the least we can do. Emily wants to talk to you about what happened, but she's with Oliver today. Perhaps tomorrow." I nodded, too exhausted to argue. "Thank you for following the rules, Sarah. Not everyone would have." With that cryptic statement, he turned and walked away. After he left, I opened the envelope. It contained $500 in cash, far more than the agreed rate for a single night of babysitting. I spent the morning in a daze, going through the motions of showering and eating breakfast without really focusing on anything. By afternoon, my curiosity had beaten my fear. I opened my laptop and began researching the Baker family. Thomas Baker was easy to find. Numerous tech industry articles mentioned his successful startup, Secure Space Solutions, which he had sold 3 years ago for an undisclosed but reportedly substantial sum. One article included a photo of Thomas and Emily at a Silicon Valley gala, both smiling professional smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. A real estate listing showed they had purchased the Berkeley Hills property shortly after selling the company. The listing described the mansion as a historic Victorian estate with original architectural features, completely updated for modern living. The asking price had been well over $4 million. I dug deeper, searching for information about the property itself. A local news website mentioned that the previous owners, the Henderson family, had lived there for less than a year before moving suddenly. A brief article quoted Mrs. Henderson saying they were relocating for her husband's job, but something about the wording seemed off, too rehearsed. An older article from 8 years ago caught my attention. "Local family's nightmare. Girl vanishes during game of hide and seek." The Hendersons' 7-year-old daughter had disappeared while playing inside the mansion. The police had searched the property extensively but found no trace of the child. 2 weeks later, she reappeared in the backyard, with no memory of where she had been. The Hendersons moved out 3 days later. I found a local history blog with a post about historic Berkeley Hills homes. It mentioned that the mansion had been built in 1897 by a Dr. Joseph Baker. I paused at the shared surname, a physician who had allegedly conducted unethical experiments on children in his care. The blog cited local rumors that orphaned children had been brought to the house and never seen again, though no formal charges were ever filed against Dr. Baker. The blog post ended with, "Dr. Baker died under mysterious circumstances in 1923, and the house changed hands numerous times over the following decades. Some owners stayed for years, while others left almost immediately. Local legend claims that children's voices can be heard in the empty halls at night." I closed my laptop, my mind racing. The Baker name connection couldn't be coincidental. Had Thomas and Emily known about the house's history when they purchased it? Was that why they had such specific rules? My phone rang at 6:47 p.m. Emily Baker's name flashed on the screen. "Hello?" I answered. "Sarah, it's Emily." Her voice sounded strained but controlled. "I wanted to apologize for what happened last night. That must have been frightening for you." "It was," I admitted. "What's happening in your house, Emily? What's wrong with Oliver?" She was quiet for a moment. "It's complicated. There are things about our home that we've been dealing with since we moved in. Oliver is sensitive to it." "Sensitive to what? The voices I heard in the hallway? The laughter?" "I can't explain everything over the phone," she said, "but I promise Oliver isn't dangerous. What you experienced was something else." I thought about the research I'd done. Something to do with Dr. Joseph Baker, the original owner? The quiet that followed told me I'd hit a nerve. "You've been looking into the house," she finally said. "Of course I have. After what happened, wouldn't you?" Emily sighed. "Yes, I suppose I would." Another pause. "Sarah, I know this is a lot to ask, but we need a sitter for Oliver again this weekend. Thomas and I have an important commitment we can't reschedule. We'll pay double your usual rate." I almost laughed. "You want me to come back after last night?" "We'll tell you everything if you do," she promised. "The full truth about the house, about what's happening with Oliver. We need someone who's already seen it and didn't run away forever. Someone who called us and followed the rules." I should have said no. Any reasonable person would have. But two things stopped me: the promise of answers to the questions burning in my mind, and the clear note of desperation in Emily's voice. "Saturday night?" I asked. "Yes, 7 o'clock. And Sarah? Thank you." After we hung up, I sat on my bed staring at the phone. The sensible part of me screamed that I was making a terrible mistake. But the student in me, the one who'd chosen anthropology because I wanted to understand the mysteries of human behavior and belief, couldn't walk away from this. I was going back to the Baker mansion, back to whatever waited in those hallways after midnight. Back to a house where a doctor had once experimented on children, where a girl had vanished playing hide and seek, where Oliver asked for water and said it wasn't enough. This time, I would be prepared. This time, I would discover what was really happening inside those walls. I couldn't focus on my Tuesday morning lecture about cultural mythology. Professor Chen's voice faded into background noise as my mind kept drifting back to the research I'd done on the Baker mansion. The connection between Thomas Baker and Dr. Joseph Baker felt too significant to be coincidental, and Emily's promise to tell me everything if I returned Saturday night wasn't helping my patience. By the time class ended, I'd made up my mind. I needed answers now, not in 3 more days. The drive up into the Berkeley Hills felt different in broad daylight. The winding roads that had seemed scary Saturday night now showed million-dollar homes tucked among eucalyptus trees, their gardens manicured and driveways filled with luxury cars. The October afternoon carried the crisp scent of autumn leaves and distant wood smoke from someone's fireplace. I parked 2 blocks down from the Baker mansion, not wanting to seem too obvious about my unexpected visit. The house looked smaller somehow in the sunlight, though no less impressive. Its Victorian architecture stood out among the more modern homes surrounding it, like something from another era that had refused to modernize along with the neighborhood. A brown delivery truck was pulling away from the circular driveway as I walked up the street. I'd watched from my car as the driver had carried several packages to the front door, Amazon boxes and what looked like a medical supply delivery. Emily had signed for them personally, which gave me the opening I'd been hoping for. I walked up to the massive oak door and knocked, rehearsing my excuse about the forgotten textbook. The story wasn't entirely made up. I had left my anthropology materials in the living room when I'd run away Saturday night. Emily opened the door after a few moments, her face cycling through surprise, concern, and something that might have been relief. "Sarah? Is everything okay?" She wore jeans and a cream-colored sweater, her blonde hair pulled back in a casual ponytail. Without the evening makeup and formal attire, she looked younger, but also more tired. Dark circles under her eyes suggested she hadn't been sleeping well since Saturday night. "I'm sorry to show up unannounced," I said, shifting my weight from foot to foot. "I realized I left my anthropology textbook here Saturday night when I had to leave quickly. I have a paper due Thursday, and I really need my notes." Emily's expression softened. "Of course, please come in." She stepped aside, holding the door open. "I should have thought to check for your things. I'm sorry." The foyer looked exactly the same as it had Saturday night, but the afternoon light streaming through the tall windows made everything seem less mysterious. Family photos still lined the walls, and the grandfather clock stood silent in the corner, waiting for its next hourly announcement. "I think I left everything in the living room," I said, following Emily down the hallway. "Let me check," she offered, leading me to the spacious living room where I'd spent most of Saturday night studying. The coffee table was clear now, no sign of the baby monitor or the notes I'd been working on. Emily moved around the room, checking behind cushions and under furniture. "I don't see anything here. Maybe Thomas moved your things somewhere safe. Let me call him." While she pulled out her phone, I looked toward the staircase. "Would it be okay if I used your bathroom? The drive up here was longer than I remembered." "Of course. There's one just off the kitchen, or if you prefer more privacy, there's one upstairs at the end of the hall." "Upstairs is fine," I said, already heading for the stairs before she could change her mind. "I'll keep looking down here," Emily called after me, her phone pressed to her ear. I climbed the grand staircase, my footsteps muffled by the thick runner. The second-floor hallway stretched in both directions, just as it had Saturday night, but the afternoon light made the space feel open rather than claustrophobic. The closed doors that had seemed so ominous in the dim sconce lighting now looked like ordinary bedroom and bathroom entrances. Instead of heading to the bathroom, I turned toward Oliver's room. The door stood slightly ajar, just as Emily always left it. I could hear Emily's voice downstairs, speaking quietly to Thomas about my visit and the missing textbook. I pushed Oliver's door open and stepped inside. The space was brighter than I'd ever seen it, with natural light coming through sheer curtains. The glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling were invisible now, and the space-themed pictures looked cheerful rather than eerie. Oliver sat on the floor near his bed, building something elaborate with colorful blocks. He wore a striped t-shirt and jeans, his light brown hair falling across his forehead as he focused on his construction. For a moment, he looked like any ordinary 6-year-old, lost in imaginative play. "Hi, Oliver," I said cautiously, not wanting to startle him. He looked up from his blocks, his large blue eyes meeting mine with that same unsettling directness I remembered from Saturday night. His expression remained completely blank, showing no surprise at finding me in his room. "You came back," he stated flatly, his voice carrying none of the warmth or excitement a normal child might show when seeing a familiar face. Most don't. A chill ran through me at his matter-of-fact tone. Most what, Oliver? He didn't answer immediately, instead returning his attention to the blocks. He placed a red rectangle on top of his structure with mechanical precision. Most people who hear them leave and never come back. I moved closer, trying to see his face more clearly. The afternoon light showed details I'd missed during my nighttime visits. The unusual paleness of his skin, the way his eyes seemed too large for his face, how still he sat, even while playing. Is that what happened Saturday night? I heard them? Oliver nodded once, still focused on his building blocks. They get loud sometimes, when they're excited. As I watched him play, something behind his bed caught my attention. There, partially hidden by the headboard's shadow, was a small door I'd never noticed before. It was painted the same soft blue as the walls, making it nearly invisible unless you were looking from the right angle. The door was maybe 3 feet high and 2 feet wide, large enough for a child to crawl through, but too small for an adult. "Oliver," I said, keeping my voice gentle, "what's that door behind your bed?" He didn't look up from his blocks, but his hands paused in their construction. "That's where the others live." The others. The simple statement made my stomach clench. "The others?" "My friends," he said, selecting another block with careful consideration. "They've been here a long time, longer than me." I heard Emily's footsteps on the stairs, her voice carrying up from the hallway as she finished her phone conversation with Thomas. My time was running out, but I needed to understand more. "Oliver, the voices I heard Saturday night, are those your friends?" He finally looked up at me again, tilting his head slightly. The gesture should have seemed childlike, but there was something ancient in his expression, as if he was accessing knowledge far beyond his years. "They're lonely," he whispered, his voice dropping so low I had to lean closer to hear him. "They've been waiting so long for someone to play with, someone to understand." "Sarah?" Emily's voice came from just outside the room. I straightened quickly as Emily appeared in the doorway. Her face went pale when she saw me talking to Oliver, and her eyes immediately shifted to her son with a look of careful assessment. "I see you've met the real Oliver," she said quietly, her voice carrying a weight of resigned exhaustion. Oliver had returned to his blocks as if our conversation had never happened, his movements mechanical and precise. Emily watched him for a moment, then looked back at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, part fear, part relief, part desperate hope, part... "Emily," I said, my voice stronger than I felt, "I need answers. What's happening to your son? What's happening in this house?" She looked at Oliver again, then stepped further into the room. When we moved in 2 years ago, Oliver was a completely normal 4-year-old. Happy, talkative, always getting into mischief. Her voice carried the pain of a mother mourning the child her son used to be. Within a month of living here, he began talking about invisible friends. At first, we thought it was just his imagination adjusting to a new home. Emily moved to the window, staring out at the afternoon light coming through the eucalyptus trees. But then he started knowing things he couldn't possibly know. Historical details about the house, names of people who had lived here decades ago. He would have conversations with empty rooms, responding to voices we couldn't hear. So you had him evaluated multiple times. Pediatric psychiatrists, neurologists, even a few doctors who specialized in childhood trauma. They all said he was physically healthy, mentally sharp, but... She turned back to face me. One doctor suggested we might be dealing with something beyond conventional medicine. I looked at Oliver, who kept building with his blocks, like we weren't talking about him. "You talked to a medium." Emily nodded. "A local woman who works with what she calls sensitive children. She spent one afternoon in this house and confirmed what we'd been scared to admit. Oliver isn't making up friends. He's talking to spirits. The spirits of children who died in this house long before we moved in. The small door behind Oliver's bed seemed to look bigger out of the corner of my eye. How many children? We don't know exactly. The medium said there were at least 5 distinct presences, maybe more, all children between the ages of 6 and 10. All of them died here between 1897 and 1923, during the time when Dr. Joseph Baker owned the house. Oliver placed another block on his structure, and I noticed his hands were trembling slightly. Whether from the conversation or something else, I couldn't tell. One spirit in particular has formed a strong attachment to Oliver, Emily continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. A boy who died of thirst while locked in a hidden room somewhere in this house. He's the one who speaks through Oliver sometimes, asking for water. The night I babysat, when Oliver said that's not enough. That was him, Emily confirmed. The boy who died of dehydration. When he takes control of Oliver, he becomes desperate for water. But nothing is ever enough to satisfy the thirst he felt when he died. I looked at the small door again, understanding beginning to dawn. Is that where he died? Behind that door? Emily followed my look and nodded slowly. We think so. We haven't opened it yet. We're afraid of what we might find. Oliver suddenly stood up, his movement so quick it made both Emily and me jump. He walked to his bed and climbed onto it, then turned to face the small door. For the first time since I'd entered the room, his expression showed emotion. A deep, sad look that seemed far too heavy for a 6-year-old to carry. He's still there, Oliver said softly, his voice carrying a different quality now, as if someone else was speaking through him. He's been waiting so long for someone to find him, to help him. Emily moved quickly to her son, sitting on the edge of the bed and gently placing a hand on his shoulder. Oliver, are you with us? He blinked several times, the strange quality leaving his voice as quickly as it had come. I'm here, Mama. I'm okay. But looking at his pale face and the exhaustion in his young eyes, I wasn't sure either of us believed that. I followed Emily out of Oliver's room, my mind spinning from what she'd just told me about the spirits of dead children. The hallway felt different now that I understood what had really been happening during my Saturday night terror. Those voices hadn't been my imagination. They'd been the desperate attempts of trapped souls trying to communicate. Emily led me past the bathroom at the end of the hall and opened a door I hadn't noticed before. The master bedroom spread out before us, decorated in muted grays and whites, with a king-sized bed taking up the center of the room. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the eucalyptus trees, and a sitting area near the fireplace held 2 wingback chairs and a small table. Thomas sat in one of the chairs, no longer wearing his usual polished appearance. His button-down shirt was wrinkled, his hair messy, and exhaustion lined his face. Across from him sat a man I didn't recognize, strong build, medium height, with short dark hair and a neatly trimmed beard with some gray. He wore dark pants and a button-up shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and something about his alert posture suggested he was used to watching his surroundings carefully. Both men looked up as we entered. Thomas got up from his chair, running a hand through his hair in a gesture that was becoming common. "Sarah," Thomas said, his voice carrying a mix of relief and apprehension. "I'm glad you came back. We owe you a full explanation." The stranger stood as well, putting out his hand toward me with a professional smile that didn't quite reach his brown eyes. "Detective Ryan Cooper, Berkeley Police Department. Though I should mention I'm here in an unofficial capacity." I shook his hand, noting the firm grip and the way his eyes seemed to check me out in those few seconds. "Sarah Wilson. I'm the babysitter who heard voices and ran away Saturday night. You're also the babysitter who followed instructions and called for help when something went wrong," Ryan said, his tone carrying a note of approval. "That's rarer than you might think." Emily gestured toward the empty chair beside the detective. "Please sit down. We have a lot to tell you, and I imagine you have questions." I settled into the chair, looking around the room. The master bedroom felt more normal than Oliver's space, But now, I found myself wondering what might be hidden behind the walls here too. I've done some research since Saturday night. I know about Dr. Joseph Baker and the original history of this house. Thomas exchanged a look with Ryan before nodding. Then you know about the children who disappeared while in his care. I read that there were rumors about unethical experiments, but no formal charges were ever filed, I said, watching their faces carefully. Ryan bent forward, his face turning serious. I've been looking into this house for the past 3 years, ever since the Henderson family's daughter went missing during that game of hide and seek. What I've found goes far beyond rumors. He reached into a leather portfolio beside his chair and pulled out a manila folder. Dr. Joseph Baker didn't just conduct unethical experiments. He systematically tortured and killed at least 7 children between 1897 and 1923. Orphans from San Francisco, children no one would miss or look for. The folder opened to show photocopied documents, old police reports, newspaper clippings, and what looked like medical records written in spidery handwriting. The formal language couldn't hide the horror of what I was reading. Children brought to the house for medical treatment and never seen again. The house is riddled with hidden rooms, Ryan continued, his voice taking on the matter-of-fact tone of someone who'd spent years dealing with disturbing evidence. Some behind false walls, others accessible only through passages that a child could navigate. Dr. Baker used these spaces to confine the children during his experiments. Emily had taken a seat on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. We've found 4 of the hidden rooms since we moved in. 3 contained skeletal remains. Children, Thomas added quietly. We had them properly buried in Sunset View Cemetery. Each time we found remains and gave them a proper burial, the paranormal activity in the house decreased. I thought about the small door behind Oliver's bed and a chill ran through me. The boy who died of thirst. His room hasn't been found yet. Ryan pulled out another document, this one covered in his own handwriting. Based on my research and the Bakers' experiences, we've identified at least 4 different child spirits still stuck in this house. The boy who died of dehydration is the strongest presence, which is why he's able to use Oliver as a conduit. But why Oliver specifically? I asked, though part of me already suspected the answer. Thomas stood and walked to the fireplace, staring into the cold hearth. Children are more sensitive to spiritual energy. Oliver's age and his natural empathy make him an ideal vessel for spirits who want to communicate with the living world. The rules Emily gave you weren't arbitrary, Ryan explained. They were developed through months of trial and error, documenting patterns in the spiritual activity. Emily's voice was barely above a whisper when she spoke. The first few months we lived here, we had no idea what was happening. Oliver would wake up screaming about children in his room. He'd ask for water constantly, drinking glass after glass, but never seeming satisfied. We thought he was having nightmares or maybe developing some kind of compulsive behavior. When did you realize it was something else? I asked. The night he spoke in a voice that wasn't his own, Thomas said, turning back to face us. He was maybe 4.5 then, and he suddenly started talking about being locked in a dark room without water for days. He described details about the house's original construction that he couldn't possibly have known. Ryan added, when Oliver asks for water and then says, "That's not enough," it indicates that the spirit of the boy who died of dehydration has temporarily taken control. The spirit is reliving the trauma of his death, desperately trying to quench a thirst that can't be satisfied. And the laughter I heard? I asked, remembering how it had multiplied and seemed to come from every direction. That's usually when another spirit is attempting to gain control, Emily explained. The children's spirits compete for Oliver's attention and energy. The laughter often precedes a more aggressive possession attempt. I looked around the room at their tired faces, at the evidence spread across Ryan's folder, at the obvious strain this situation had placed on the family. Why don't you just leave? Sell the house and move somewhere else? Thomas and Emily looked at each other for a long moment before Thomas walked to the wall and pushed against what appeared to be a decorative panel. It swung open, showing a small wall safe. He got a leather-bound journal and returned to his chair. "Because we can't abandon them," he said simply, placing the journal on the table between us. "These children have been trapped here for over a century. They deserve peace." The journal was old, its leather cover cracked and stained. Thomas opened it carefully, revealing pages covered in the same spidery handwriting I'd seen in Ryan's photocopies. "Dr. Baker's personal records," Thomas explained. "We found this hidden in the original study when we renovated the third floor. It documents everything. The children he brought here, the experiments he performed, the locations where he disposed of their bodies." I leaned forward to check out the journal, my stomach turning as I read entries describing children as nothing more than test subjects. The clinical detachment in Dr. Baker's writing made the horror even more scary. "Thomas discovered something else when he researched the house's history," Emily said. "Something that convinced us we were meant to be here." Thomas flipped to a page near the front of the journal. "Dr. Joseph Baker wasn't my relative as far as I can figure out, but the shared surname wasn't coincidental, at least not in the way I initially thought." He pointed to an entry dated 1898. Dr. Baker wrote about his belief that certain bloodlines carried spiritual sensitivity. He specifically sought out children with surnames that appeared in his genealogical research. Children named Baker were considered particularly valuable for his experiments. The implication shocked me. He targeted children because of their names? Among other criteria, yes. Oliver's surname makes him especially attractive to Dr. Baker's spirit, which we believe still inhabits this house. The doctor's spirit acts as an anchor, preventing the children's souls from moving on. Ryan gathered his papers and returned them to the folder. "The spiritual activity follows predictable patterns based on Oliver's presence and emotional state. Dr. Baker's spirit seems to view Oliver as unfinished business, another Baker child to add to his collection." A knock at the bedroom door interrupted the conversation. Emily got up to answer it, revealing a woman in her mid-30s with black hair pulled back in a neat bun. She wore a professional blazer over a simple top and carried what looked like a large equipment case. "Dr. Natalie Martinez," the woman introduced herself, stepping into the room. "UC Berkeley, Department of Paranormal Research. Thomas called me about tonight's session." Thomas stood to greet her. "Natalie, thank you for coming on such short notice. This is Sarah, the babysitter who experienced the strange thing Saturday night." Natalie set down her equipment case and shook my hand, her grip confident and her brown eyes sharp with intelligence. "I've looked over the documentation Thomas sent me about your experiences. Your observations could be really valuable for tonight's investigation." "Investigation?" I asked, looking between the assembled adults. "We're going to attempt direct communication with the spirits," Natalie explained, opening her case to reveal an array of electronic devices I didn't recognize. EMF detectors, digital thermometers, audio recording equipment designed to capture electronic voice phenomena. We need to locate the remaining spirits and help them find peace. Emily returned to her seat on the bed, her expression tense. "We've tried this before, but the sessions become too intense for Oliver. That's why we need another person present. Someone who's already experienced the manifestations and didn't flee permanently." "Oliver will be present during the session?" I asked, alarm creeping into my voice. "He has to be," Thomas explained. "He's the primary conduit. Without him, we can't establish reliable communication." Natalie began checking her equipment, her movements quick and practiced. "I specialize in cases involving child mediums. Oliver won't be in any physical danger, but the experience can be emotionally hard. Having familiar adults present helps maintain his psychological stability." Ryan stood and gathered his portfolio. "I'll be documenting everything for the official record. Once we locate the remaining spirits and properly bury their remains, this house should return to normal." "And if we can't locate them?" I asked. The room fell silent. Emily's hands tightened in her lap, and Thomas stared at the journal in front of him. Finally, Natalie spoke. Then Oliver will continue to serve as a vessel for increasingly desperate spirits, and the paranormal activity will get worse as he grows older and his abilities get stronger. She finished checking her equipment and looked directly at me. Sarah, I know this is a lot to process, but we could really use your help tonight. Your sensitivity to the manifestations, combined with your outsider perspective, could provide insights we've missed. I thought about Oliver's pale face and vacant expression, about the sadness in his eyes when he spoke about his invisible friends. I thought about children who had died horrible deaths in this house over a century ago, their souls trapped and desperate for release. What time do we start? I asked. Natalie smiled for the first time since arriving. Midnight, when the veil between worlds is thinnest. I spent the hours between our afternoon meeting and midnight trying to process everything I'd learned about Dr. Joseph Baker and the children who died in this house. Emily had invited me to stay for dinner, though none of us ate much. What we planned to do hung over the table, making even casual conversation feel forced. Oliver had seemed more quiet than usual during the meal, picking at his food and staring at empty spaces around the dining room. When I asked if he was okay, he looked at me with those unnaturally serious blue eyes and said, "They're excited. They know something's going to happen tonight." Now, at 11:47 p.m., I followed the others down into the mansion's basement, my hands gripping the wooden railing as we went down the narrow stairs. The basement stretched larger than I'd expected, with stone walls and a concrete floor that felt decades newer than the house above. Storage boxes lined one wall, and an old furnace buzzed quietly in the corner, but most of the space stood empty. Natalie moved efficiently around the room, unpacking her equipment case and positioning various devices at strategic points. She placed small black boxes along the walls, EMF detectors, she'd explained earlier, and set up a digital recorder on a folding table she'd brought down. The electronic devices beeped softly as they set themselves up, their small screens casting blue and green light in the dim basement lighting. "The electromagnetic field readings are already elevated," Natalie said, checking one of her devices. "This is consistent with significant spiritual activity." Ryan stood near the stairs with a digital camera and a thick notebook, writing down the setup process. He'd changed into dark jeans and a sweater, looking less like a detective and more like someone ready for manual work. His brown eyes followed every movement as Natalie worked, and I could see him mentally writing down details for his official record. Thomas carried Oliver down the stairs, the boy's small body limp with sleep in his father's arms. Oliver wore his space-themed pajamas and held a stuffed dinosaur against his chest. His light brown hair fell across his forehead and his breathing stayed deep and steady. Seeing him so peaceful made what we were about to do feel even more wrong. "Are you sure about this?" I asked Emily as Thomas placed Oliver on a small camping cot they'd set up in the corner. "He looks so normal when he's sleeping." Emily adjusted a blanket around her son, her movements gentle but her expression tense. "He's never truly normal anymore, Sarah. Even when he sleeps, I can see him reacting to things we can't see. Sometimes he has conversations in his sleep with people who aren't there." Thomas stood up from the cot, running a hand through his hair. "Oliver acts as a bridge between our world and theirs. The spirits can use his energy to show up more clearly, which is why the activity gets stronger when he's present." Natalie finished arranging her equipment and checked her watch. 5 minutes until midnight. The electromagnetic readings have kept climbing since we came down here. I moved closer to the EMF detector nearest to Oliver's cot. The small screen showed numbers that meant nothing to me, but Natalie's expression suggested they were important. "What exactly are we hoping to accomplish tonight?" "Direct communication," she replied, pulling out a handheld device that looked like a modified radio. "If the spirits can access Oliver's energy, we should be able to establish two-way contact. From there, we can ask specific questions about their remains and help them find peace." Ryan positioned himself where he could photograph both Oliver and the equipment readings. We've found 3 hidden rooms so far, but Dr. Baker's journal mentions 7 children who died here. We need to find the remaining bodies. The basement got noticeably colder as the grandfather clock upstairs began chiming midnight. I pulled my sweater tighter around my shoulders, watching as my breath became visible in small puffs. The temperature drop felt fake, like someone had opened a massive freezer door. Oliver moved on the cot, his eyelids moving, but not opening. His grip on the stuffed dinosaur loosened, and his breathing changed from the deep rhythm of sleep to something shallower and more uneven. Then the voices started. They began as whispers, just like Saturday night, but this time I wasn't alone in hearing them. Emily moved closer to Thomas, her face pale but determined. Ryan raised his camera, and Natalie watched her equipment readings with intense focus. The whispers got louder, overlapping and multiplying until they became a chorus of children's voices. But unlike Saturday night, when the sounds had been muffled and unclear, I could now make out individual words. Help us. Find us. So cold. Want to go home? Natalie activated her handheld device and a crackling sound filled the basement. Can you hear me? She spoke clearly into the device. We're here to help you. Can you tell us your names? The voices quieted for a moment, then one spoke more clearly than the others. A boy's voice, young and frightened. Tommy. My name is Tommy. Oliver sat upright on the cot with no transition from sleep to wakefulness. His eyes opened, but they stared straight ahead without seeing anything in the room. His face had taken on that blank expression I'd seen before, as if someone else was looking out through his features. Tommy died in the cold room, Oliver said, but his voice carried a different quality, older, more desperate. Behind the wine cellar. He's been waiting so long. Natalie leaned closer to her equipment. Tommy, can you show us where you are? One of the EMF detectors near the far wall began beeping rapidly. Ryan followed the sound, his camera ready, while Thomas grabbed a flashlight from the storage boxes. Here, Oliver said, pointing toward the wall where the detector was most active. Behind the stones. Thomas ran his hands along the stone wall, pressing against different sections. Ryan, help me check for loose mortar. They worked carefully, testing each stone while Natalie continued her communication through Oliver. She asked about other children, and 2 more names came up. Catherine, who was hidden where the water used to flow, and Michael, whose remains were under the wooden floor in the dark place. After several minutes of searching, Ryan found a section where the mortar crumbled at his touch. Thomas, this section feels different. They worked together, prying at the loose stones with tools Thomas had brought from his garage. The wall gave way suddenly, showing a space maybe 3 feet high and 4 feet wide. Thomas shined his flashlight inside, and I heard him take a sharp breath. Dear God, he whispered. Ryan got ready to take photos while I moved closer, though part of me didn't want to see. The hidden room had a small skeleton, the bones yellowed with age but clearly belonging to a child. Scraps of fabric stuck to the remains, what might once have been clothing. Tommy, Emily said softly, tears gathering in her eyes. We found you. Natalie documented the electromagnetic readings while Ryan photographed every angle of the discovery. The voices in the basement had grown quieter, but I could still hear them whispering among themselves. That's 1, Thomas said, carefully examining the chamber without disturbing the remains. According to the journal, there should be at least 3 more. We spent the next hour following similar processes. Oliver, still in his trance-like state, directed us to 2 more locations. Behind a false panel near the furnace, we found Catherine's remains. Under a section of wooden flooring that Thomas pried up with a crowbar, we found Michael. Each discovery brought a clear change in the basement's atmosphere. The voices grew less desperate, more peaceful. The temperature began returning to normal, and Natalie's equipment showed decreasing electromagnetic activity. But as Ryan finished photographing Michael's remains, Oliver suddenly sat bolt upright on his cot. His eyes opened wide, but they remained completely vacant, staring at something none of us could see. "He's still here," Oliver said, but this voice was different from the children's voices we'd been hearing. This voice carried authority and malice. "The doctor. He won't let us leave." The lights overhead flickered once, then began flashing in an irregular pattern. In the corner of the basement where we'd found Tommy's remains, a shadow began forming, tall and imposing, darker than the surrounding darkness. "Everyone stay calm," Natalie said, but I could hear tension in her voice as she checked her equipment. The shadow grew larger and more defined, taking on the shape of a man in formal clothing. The temperature plummeted again, more dramatically than before, and the whispered voices of the children returned with increased urgency. "No, no, no," they pleaded. "Don't let him take us back." Emily rushed to Oliver's cot and gathered him in her arms. His body remained rigid, his eyes still vacant, but he didn't resist her touch. "We need to leave," Thomas said, moving toward the stairs. "Everyone upstairs now." I grabbed Natalie's equipment case while she picked up her handheld devices. The shadow in the corner kept growing, and I could swear I saw the outline of a face within it, sharp features and cold eyes that seemed to follow our movements. Ryan took one final photograph of the shadow before following us up the stairs. Behind us, the basement lights went out completely, covering the space in total darkness. We gathered in the living room, everyone breathing hard. Emily held Oliver on the couch, gently stroking his hair until his eyes came back into focus and he looked around the room in confusion. "What happened?" he asked in his normal 6-year-old voice. "Why are we downstairs?" Natalie set up her equipment on the coffee table, reviewing the readings and recordings from our basement session. Her face was grim as she analyzed the data. "Dr. Baker's spirit is definitely still present," she confirmed, "and he's acting as an anchor, preventing the children's souls from moving on to whatever comes after death." Thomas sat heavily in one of the armchairs. "We found 3 more sets of remains tonight, but it didn't help the children find peace." "The children's spirits are bound to Dr. Baker's will," Natalie explained. "He's maintaining control over them even in death. To free them all, we need to locate his remains and perform a specific ritual to break his hold." Ryan flipped through his notebook, reviewing the information we'd gathered. "Dr. Baker's journal doesn't mention where his own body was buried. The official records show he died under mysterious circumstances, but there's no gravesite listed." I thought about the small door behind Oliver's bed, about the sadness in his eyes when he'd looked at it this afternoon. An idea began forming in my mind, one that made my stomach tighten with worry. "The door in Oliver's room," I said slowly. "The small one behind his bed. Oliver said that's where his friends live, but what if it's not just a hiding place for the children's spirits?" Emily's face went pale. "You think Dr. Baker's remains might be behind that door?" "Think about it," I continued, the pieces clicking together in my mind. Dr. Baker was obsessed with controlling these children. Where better to hide his own body than in a secret room connected to the space where he kept his favorite victims? Natalie packed up her equipment with renewed purpose. It makes sense. If Dr. Baker's physical remains are hidden somewhere in the house, that would explain why his spirit maintains such a strong presence. Thomas stood and walked to the window, staring out at the dark grounds. "That door has been in Oliver's room since we moved in. We've never tried to open it because the spiritual activity becomes so intense whenever we get close." "But now we know why," Ryan said, closing his notebook. "Dr. Baker doesn't want his hiding place discovered." Emily looked down at Oliver, who had fallen back asleep in her arms. "If we do this, if we go through that door, there's no telling how Dr. Baker's spirit will react. He's already shown us tonight that he won't allow the children to find peace," I said. "If we don't confront him directly, Oliver will never be free of this." Natalie shouldered her equipment case. "I have everything we need for a banishment ritual. Once we locate Dr. Baker's remains, we can break the spiritual bonds and allow all the souls in this house to move on. The room fell silent as we all considered what lay ahead. Oliver slept peacefully in his mother's arms, looking like any normal child who'd had a long day. But I knew that behind his closed eyelids, the spirits of Dr. Baker's victims were still trapped, still waiting for someone to set them free. Thomas turned back to face us, his expression determined. Then we do it. Tomorrow night we open that door and confront Dr. Baker's spirit once and for all.